Hello, my name is Angel Aquino, and I'm a member of the 1890 Society and a student at Patrick Henry College. We will now begin our first session, titled America's Founding to the 1920s, the Hamiltonian Norm Ascendant. Now, due to a scheduling shift, the moderator of this panel is Dr. William Beach. Dr. Beach is the Coffin Family Fellow at the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, and he served as the 15th Commissioner of Labor Statistics from 2019 to 2023. Before joining the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Dr. Beach was Vice President for Policy Research at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Please welcome Dr. William Beach and our esteemed panelists.
This is the first panel in our discussion of the history of the norm, the history of debt. There will be this panel and two more that will be explicitly historical. Those of you in the room who lived the history of the second and third panels will not see them as history, but for those of you who are under the age of 25, they are most distinctively history. But this panel lays the foundation for the next three. The final panel of the day is a panel on solutions, on what we could do, what are the next steps, if you will. From the 1790s onward, the financial authorities of the United States federal government carefully established practices and policies to build trust in the quality and convertibility of debt. It's important that the debt be convertible into other asset forms or other currencies at the value at which it is stated to be. They did so through periods of rapid population and geographic growth of just unparalleled nature, and not to mention the technological change that through Civil War, through riots, through World War, through major cultural change. From the founding through World War I, there emerged an emphasis on the quality of federal debt, which we're calling today the Hamiltonian norm, that assured lenders to the United States government, oftentimes foreign lenders, that our bills would be paid as promised, as Senator Welch so eloquently underscored, with interest on time and without risk of loss through inflation or financial mismanagement. There's another term that you may hear, and forgive me if it sounds technical, but today economists talk about that as monetary dominance of the monetary standards over the fiscal standards, and that the Congress would defer to the monetary authorities because the debt is primary to all of our trade relations and all of our economic activity and so forth. So this panel is going to be discussing that. It's sort of like the opening panel, and we are really pleased to have so many excellent people here today discussing aspects of this history. This is not your history 101 that carefully goes through, week after week. We're going to do all of American history almost in one panel. Our first speaker, I'm going to introduce you. Doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Our first speaker is Congressman French Hill, who represents Arkansas's 2nd Congressional District in the House of Representatives. Representative Hill will be speaking on Hamilton's plan to utilize America's debt to solidify the new government's credit. So you get to sing all the great songs from that musical Hamilton, is that right? Congressman French.
Well, Dr. Beach, thank you, and it's great to be with the scholars and the senators, our students, the Coolidge trustees, and all my colleagues, both current and former. What a great topic, and what a needed topic today. And my assignment is to open us up at the beginning of the Republic. During my days at the Treasury Department, my sunny office in the main Treasury building looked down over Alexander Hamilton's statue. And every time I would look out my window, I would see the back of his head. And as then as today, in my office is an engraving of Hamilton overlooking my desk. That's his famous pose leaning against the artillery ramparts at Yorktown. As someone who grew up loving finance, I majored in economics, and I got to spend my high school and college days working for my dad and my grandfather, who were both financial investment guys that grew up working together and also at a local community bank. And so finance was in my blood as a kid. And at age 32, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Hamilton's creation, the U.S. Treasury. In comparison, Hamilton was America's first Secretary of the Treasury at age 35. He was a classic example of an extraordinary mind and energy who fully complied with Malcolm Gladwell's famous 10,000 hours in his mastery of trade and finance. While just a boy on the island of St. Croix, under the stewardship of successful merchant Nicholas Kruger, Hamilton learned all the intricacies of trade, foreign exchange, the value of sound money, and how to structure short and long-term obligations when he was a teenager. Alongside Hamilton's Virginian collaborator in the Federalist Papers, James Madison, they gave birth to our beloved constitutional republic. In the winter of 1790, they were on the cusp of crafting a modern financial system. In the preceding hundreds of years, only 2 countries had succeeded in crafting such a system: the Dutch and the English. Robert Morris, the principal financial officer of the independent colonies during the Revolution and the Confederation, was eager to get back to business and leave government. And so he urged President Washington to tap Washington's young protege, Hamilton, as the first Treasury Secretary. On January 8, 1790, in the Senate chamber in Federal Hall in New York, President Washington delivered, as we will hear President Biden tonight, the inaugural State of the Union address. He admonished the Senate and the House of Representatives of their duty to the country and stressed the, quote, necessity of cooperation to uphold a functioning republic. The very next day, Treasury Secretary Hamilton transmitted his first report on the public credit to the House. Over the next few months, Washington's charge of the necessity of cooperation would be sorely tested. In Hamilton's report on public credit, he argued persuasively that the accumulated debts of the republic, both foreign and domestic, as well as the accumulated debts of each of the colonies, should all become a federal obligation. When structured properly, the result would restore the credit available on favorable terms and capital to support growth in the new republic. At the time, the credit of the United States was in shambles, literally not worth a continental. The years of revolution, enfeebled Confederation, and the war needs of the individual colonies had aggregated to $80 million in total debt. Hamilton considered this accumulated debt the price of liberty. Hamilton's recommendation to the House included fully repaying the $11.7 million in foreign debt, mostly to France, as well as $40 million owned by the new republic to its own citizens. This was not particularly controversial and well anticipated in all the 1780 debates of the Constitution. During those debates, both Hamilton and Madison were on the same page about the need for consolidating the debts as a federal obligation. Article 6 of the Constitution, quote, all debts and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution shall be valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. But in the winter of 1790, Hamilton's Federalist collaborator, James Madison, now 39 years old, serving in Congress, was no longer on the same page. He opposed exchanging at par value the $40 million in domestic debt, and he opposed assuming all the debts of the colonies. This was at the heart of the debate that would grind away from the cold of January to the heat of the summer of 1790. Madison objected to paying par for the domestic debt accumulated during the Revolution, as many of the original holders of that debt had been, out of necessity, forced to sell their debt and their bonds at a discount over the years. Thus, in Madison's view, exchanging them at par would reward the speculators which was the word of the day, that had bought the debt at a discount. And as a Virginian, Madison also objected to the assumption of $25 million of state debts, as it was fundamentally unfair to be taxed to pay back state debts when Virginians had already been quite fiscally responsible and already paid back their debt. In a victory for Hamilton's plan, the House passed the exchange plan for the existing debt over Madison's objection in February 1790. However, Hamilton suffered a setback in April when the House voted down his proposal of rolling up all the individual state debts 5 different times. He went to the House floor 5 different times. It was voted down. They were in a real logjam. So as summer approached, the new Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, then 47 years old, tells the tale. He was just back from 5 years in France, so he wasn't here for the constitutional debates. Jefferson was busy tending to our business in France and making sure that we had the financial arrangements that we needed. But having just returned from France, he had just acquired a new house in New York, and he was on his way to a meeting one afternoon with President Washington when he ran into Secretary Hamilton on the street. He described him as looking somber, haggard, and dejected beyond description. In other words, like a congressman or a cabinet member. But Jefferson went on to say he even looked uncouth, neglected. Jefferson, despite suffering from terrible migraine headaches this month and trying to move into a new house, believed that he could, quote, spur a friendly discussion and a conciliation of views on this topic. Hamilton had not found the magic formula, something that came very naturally to him. Hamilton always found the magic formula, but he had not found the magic formula to move his stalled plan through the House. Jefferson suggested a working dinner at his home with Madison. They gathered at Jefferson's house on that fateful meal at 57 Maiden Lane. The only thing more vexing in Congress that spring, other than Hamilton's insistence that we roll up all the consolidated debts, was the equally aggravating topic of where to locate the new national capital. Among 16 locations considered by Congress, the leading candidates were, and it sounds like an Amtrak map, Annapolis, Baltimore, Carlisle, Frederick, Germantown, New York, Philadelphia, the Potomac, Susquehanna, and Trenton. Being centrally located, Pennsylvania was consistently considered as having the edge, home of Benjamin Franklin, home of the current government, signing the Declaration of Independence. They kind of thought they had it in the bag. But a solution at that dinner began to take shape whereby Hamilton would obtain the necessary House votes for the consolidation of debts, and Madison and the Southerners would get settlement before assumption of the debt. Settlement before the assumption of the debt, meaning Virginians would have a modification in their future burden since they'd already paid their debt back. And finally, the permanent U.S. capital would be located on the Potomac River after being in Philadelphia for 10 years. Building the new capital in the Potomac had long been the objective of George Washington. Thus, this compromise of 1790 was one of the most essential steps along the extraordinary path from revolution to independence to building the most amazing republic in history. So he got the votes. So let's hear what Hamilton's plan was to restore the credit you heard Senator Welch talk about. The total debt, as outlined to the penny in Hamilton's first report to the Congress, was $54,124,060,064. And it had cents, but I took it off my report. Think about that. There's no Excel spreadsheet. Hamilton estimated the annual interest on the foreign debt and the interest on the domestic debt at 4% would amount to about $2.2 million in annual debt service. He also estimated that the accumulated war debt in the Confederation debts of the states was about $25 million. So based on the assessments of the Republic's early gross domestic product, the size of our total early economy, economists believe that this nearly $80 million in debt was about 40% of GDP. About 40% of GDP. And if you were with Jim Grant last night and with Phil Graham's comment, the issue is, can you serve that debt? Not how big the debt is, but what is the debt service? Prior to the ratification of the Constitution and the formation of the government, the colonies effectively were bankrupt, as I said, not worth a continental, with no ability to raise tax revenue to keep foreign or domestic creditors current. The Secretary recommended that interest on the foreign debt be paid in full, no change in the terms from the French or the Dutch, but the domestic debt holders would, quote, voluntarily agree to have the full value of their debts funded by a new loan at a reduced rate of interest at that 4% level instead of the original coupon, which was 6%, thereby reducing the annual debt service. Now, but an emphasis, voluntarily, it's not a mandate. They would do an exchange. The foreign debt was owed mostly to France. America would have never won the revolution without Benjamin Franklin's arranging of funding, arms, and uniforms from France, as well as Washington and Lafayette's persuading the French fleet to the Chesapeake. Thanks to John Adams, the Dutch advanced funds, and the Spanish provided the gunpowder that we fought with from the Caribbean. The Dutch bankers, at Hamilton's request, arranged a rollover of America's foreign debt, which was completed in 1795. Hamilton's masterful proposed restructuring of the domestic debt took the form of an amazing combination from this young 30-year-old person living in the 1790s. He could be right there on Wall Street today. Quote, took the form of 3 new securities: a 6% bond, a 3% bond, and a 6% bond with the interest deferred for 10 years, with public creditors receiving a package of the 3 that yielded the 4% current coupon in exchange for all their old debt. By September of 1791, 1 year later, in an economy where you rode horse to let people know what was going on, 31 million of the 64 million had been fully converted. This process was completed a month before Hamilton stepped down as the Treasury Secretary in 1794, 4 years later, with a fully 98% of all the domestic debt having been voluntarily exchanged for the new securities. But finally, to Phil Graham and Jim Grant's point, how to pay the $4 million in debt service and current expenses of the government. Congress had authorized tariffs and some excise taxes. But Hamilton's genius, which we don't talk about enough, was in crafting the other building block besides the debt exchange, which was, in December 1790, submitting his plan for the formation of a national bank and crafting the functioning securities market. This bank would be the creditor to the U.S. in the case of any revenue shortfall, as well as make loans to entrepreneurs and business people. Likewise, the securities market would facilitate the U.S. to sell their own debt securities as well as fund startup businesses. From the beginning, Hamilton's bank proposal created a legal challenge. Many of the founders had concerns. Congressman Madison, Secretary Jefferson, Attorney General Randolph believed that such a bank was not authorized by the Constitution. Hamilton countered with the charge by crafting the doctrine of implied powers, which carried the day, and Washington approved the bank in 1791, and the bank quickly proved its strategic value in loaning money to the government as excise taxes and tariffs caught up for any shortfalls. Thus, in just 4 years from that fateful dinner in 1790 that prompted the compromise that facilitated the functioning financial system for our country that we have today, in 4 years, the United States possessed the highest credit rating in the world. Its securities were liquid and traded freely. And Hamilton and Robert Morris's dream of a free republic with a sound source of financing had come true. This brought to reality Hamilton's aspirational letter to Robert Morris back in 1781 when he argued a national debt, if it's not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for getting us off to such a great start. So the great crisis of the Revolution, which prompted so many important moves in this topic, this subject area, that kind of was challenged just a few decades later by the Civil War, by the reconstruction of the Union. And here to talk about that particular period is Dr. Michael Caires. Dr. Caires is a scholar of 19th century political economy. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Virginia. Thus, he's very pleased that we did put the capital where we did, right? And suppose the University of Pennsylvania. His dissertation was entitled The Greenback Union, Creating the American Monetary Union in the Civil War. Dr. Caires will talk to us about the financial struggles that America endured during and after the Civil War. Michael, the yours.
Thank you, Dr. Beach, and thank you to the conference's organizers. I have the unenviable position of having to represent, I guess, 1830 to the 1890s. No problem. I can do that. So if anybody has any questions about that period, we can talk about it. The focus of my research, though, is dead center in the Civil War. And my story starts in the winter of 1862, winter of 1861, winter of 1862. You can imagine Sam and Pete Chase. If you go to the Treasury building, I don't know if they still have tours, but I did get the opportunity to see his office one time. I was probably the only person excited to do that, but I did get to see it. And I imagine him in that room anxious. Chase, who served as Secretary of the Treasury from 1861 to 1864 under Abraham Lincoln, faced an increasing pile of unpaid warrants and requisitions on the Treasury that he could not pay. In late December, the banks of the East Coast had rejected the financial policies of Chase and had refused to loan money or pay out any specie, gold or silver, to the public. And this was an absolute disaster. Without the gold in the vaults of the banks of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, the government had no way to pay its soldiers or pay for supplies in the early part of the Civil War. Sometime in January, Chase apparently pointed to a pile of papers on his desk at the Treasury and exclaimed, "Here are $50 million in these unsigned warrants for adjusted accounts, and I have not $1 in the Treasury." So and actually something that I should give credit to Professor Bruner on this, something that we'll call the Panic of 1861 was incredibly important to this story. And you probably never heard of the Panic of 1861. You'd be hard-pressed to find it in a textbook. It's not similar to the traditional financial panics we think of the 19th century, like 1819, 1837, 1873, or 1893. But the events of December to February 1862 constituted a critical financial and political panic set in the middle of the Civil War. It was not a panic strictly in economic terms because it was not the result of a boom in credit followed by a sudden and rapid decline in available credit. Well, in some ways it was, but there was no boom preceding it. The Panic of 1861 occurred when the major banks of the East Coast suspended specie payments. They had agreed to borrow $150 million from the federal government, agreed to in the summer of 1861. So this would have been the period when the war started in earnest. So the Battle of Bull Run was in the summer of 1861. A special session of Congress was called together. And to float the bond issue, the banks of the most important financial centers in the Union at the time, so Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, had agreed to take the bond issue in three different sections. So one for $50 million, another one for $50 million, and a last one for $50 million. And they didn't agree to the last one for $50 million. For some technical reasons, if anybody's curious, I'm happy to talk to during the question and answer section. But what it meant was a serious liquidity crisis for the federal government. In taking the dramatic action, the bankers were trying to protect themselves. The Treasury was in a tough spot. And the financial panic morphed into a significant policy panic when federal officials struggled to find new ways to restore order to financial markets and provide a long-term means to pay for the war. So while not a classical creditor asset bubble, the Panic of 1861 left a lasting legacy on American financial history by pushing the federal government into new areas and leading to a reformation of American financial networks, which endured to this day. At first, the United States Congress attempted to pay for their efforts to put down the rebellion in the South with a massive loan that I just talked about. But with the third installment, the New York banks had rejected that. In December, Congress started trying to put together a plan of what they were going to do. Through January and February of 1862, Congress debated a bill that would have the U.S. government print its own money for the first time since the American Revolution. So the reference to the Continental is apt. The Republicans who controlled Congress, so this was the 37th Congress, the first of the Civil War period, did not find this an easy solution. Republicans like Senator Charles Sumner, who were basically hard money in their views, found it, quote, reluctantly painful to consent to the act, quote, a remedy which at any other moment you would reject. Congress passed the law authorizing the first $150 million and would popularly come to known as greenbacks, which would grow to about $400 million by the end of the Civil War. And there were other various issues that were money-like, including fractional notes that were worth less than $1. The critical thing, though, I'm sure many of you have heard the colloquial term greenback that you could use for $1 today. At the time, it was a brand new idea. They were called greenbacks. I didn't bring one with me, sadly. They were green on the back, and if you actually, I'm the only one who actually made all of you bring my only handout with you. It's in your pocket right now. I don't want to make this uncomfortable for anyone, so don't pull out any money out of your pocket right now. But when you get home, take out $1. And the interesting thing that's different from the Revolutionary period is that these greenbacks were made a legal tender. So what does that mean? So it says on notes today, and it said on the notes back then, this note is a legal tender for all debts, public and private. So that was a dramatic change. It was Congress's effort to give currency to these notes so they'd be accepted by the public. Now, about a year later, Chase followed this policy with a program of nationally chartered banks. The government would create a new system of banking, which if you're thinking to yourself, a civil war is a great time to do that. Well, it wasn't. And the idea of the national banking system is a little confusing. The actual acts to create is called an act for a uniform currency, because the idea was that the banking system would be a long-term way to issue a stable currency. Now, unlike the First Bank of the United States or the Second Bank of the United States, this was not a single bank with branches. It wasn't just one bank. It would be hundreds of banks all across the country. Chase sold this program as a way to raise money for the war effort. To become a national bank during the Civil War, you had to buy a certain amount of federal bonds to hold as reserve in issuing notes. And the banking system itself would eventually prove a popular solution to supplant the older system of state chartered banks that had dominated really from the period of the early republic all the way to the Civil War. So Congress created the national banking system in 1863 and modified it again in 1864 and 1865. Now, these two policies, the Legal Tender Act, greenbacks, and the national banking system, have been the focus of my prior research. Now, I have apologized to Dr. Beach and everybody who would listen to me at the conference. Sadly, I don't want to say that I'm an expert in the federal debt issue of the Civil War, but there, too, there were innovations, and I'm happy to speak about those if anyone has any questions during the Q&A part. In this period, the federal government, of course, did float a massive bond issue for the time, and there were innovative things about that as well. This is probably the first period in American history where there was a popular loan that was floated directly to the American public. So if you've ever heard of Jay Cook, Jay Cook's agents went all across the country selling bonds directly to the American public in denominations as low as $50. There was, of course, changes in American taxation during the Civil War. Famously, the first income tax was passed during the Civil War, and a return, actually, of the excise taxes that were present in the Hamiltonian period, which, of course, the Jeffersonian administration had gotten rid of right when they got in office, but they come back again during the Civil War. Out of all of them, I find the greenbacks the most interesting of the lot, as they had dramatic effects on the financial networks of the 19th century, the place of the federal government in the economy. And of course, they would become central to the politics for the rest of the century as well. I look forward to our conversation and talking about how the union's finances fit into that picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Michael. And I'm really pleased that you introduced the monetary, because we will, in the next two panels, have a discussion in part on the interplay between our monetary system and debt financing. That was just excellent. Our third speaker is Dr. Robert Bruner, who served at the University of Virginia as university professor, distinguished professor of business administration, and the 8th dean of the Darden School, and Compton visiting professor in world politics at the Miller Center of Public Affairs. Wow. Dr. Bruner will speak on the Panic of 1907 and how its consequences have shaped our modern system of monetary regulation. Dr. Bruner's book on the Panic of 1907 is worth everybody's reading, so I hope that you'll pick it up as soon as possible. Professor Bruner.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beach. It's a pleasure to see you all. And in my few minutes with you this morning, I would like to tell you about one of the lesser known but much more important financial events in the economic and political history of the United States. The much more is contained in this book to which he just referred, and you can consult the details there. But I'm going to give you the sketch at the moment, which should serve as the basis for your questions to come. So the panic consists of a few events. The highlights are, first, it began in a boom, a decade-long economic expansion from 1896 to 1906 that was perhaps the largest in U.S. history, so large that it strained the financial system of the country to be able to fund the growth of railroads, manufacturing, commerce, you name it. Then a shock hit the system. The San Francisco earthquake of April 18, 1906, triggered massive insurance claims and credit requirements to rebuild the city. Central banks around the world began to raise interest rates in an effort to withhold the gold to be sent to the U.S. and keep it for their own purposes. Of course, rising interest rates meant that credit conditions worsened substantially in the U.S. Enterprises and even state governments, state and local governments, the city of New York found it increasingly difficult to finance their ongoing operations. Then a prominent stock market speculation in the fall of 1907 failed spectacularly and brought down first two brokerage firms, which triggered runs on banks and trust companies believed to be affiliated with the promoters of the speculation. And into the midst of this maelstrom came J.P. Morgan, who, along with Alexander Hamilton, should rank as one of the premier leaders in the financial history of the U.S. Morgan, at the time, was 70 years old. He was in Richmond, Virginia, attending a church convention and took a private train back to New York City on the night of October 2021 to organize a response team. He called together the presidents of major financial institutions of the city, as well as major industrialists, wealthy individuals, and they met at his library on Madison Avenue and 30th, 32nd, 33rd Street. He is, you can go there today and see this august room in which people met more or less continuously for the next 3 weeks. What Morgan did was mobilize collective action. This is one of the remarkable, perhaps the only instance of a privately directed rescue in an effort to quell a financial crisis in the United States. Morgan succeeded. It was touch and go. He rescued major financial institutions, corporations. Again, New York City nearly defaulted on its debts. and even the New York Stock Exchange. From this effort, the crisis gradually subsided, but guess what? The economic spillovers of this crisis continued for quite some while. It took another year for the New York financial indexes, stock index, to recover to its pre-crisis height, but in fact, the output of the United States remained depressed for years following the crisis. This is what we call an economic spillover of a crisis. Of course, with economic spillovers, the mood of voters soured. And bit by bit, they threw out of office. First, members of Congress, shifting the majority of the House of Representatives from Republican to Democrat, then the Senate with a similar shift, and finally in 1912, the White House shifted, so that by March of 1913, power of the United States in both houses of Congress and the White House resided in the Democratic Party. The insurgents, the newly elected members of the House, members of the Senate, and the White House wasted no time in an effort to reform. And by and large, these insurgents were of a new breed. They were both populists of the ilk of William Jennings Bryan and his followers, who took a decidedly anti-elite view. Often there were representatives from farming districts, mining districts in the far west, in any event, people who were quite unhappy with the financial administration of the country ever since the Civil War. The second group would be progressives, people who believed that new social sciences and economics, sociology, even politics would if the research were attended to, would help direct public policies throughout the United States. And these progressives were particularly alarmed at the effects of industrialization, urbanization, and related ills of the country. They wanted to direct the efforts of government, marshal government, in an effort to ameliorate these problems. Theodore Roosevelt, Republican president who stepped in to the presidency following the assassination of William McKinley, styled himself as a progressive, but arguably was a conservative as well. But his successor, William Howard Taft, also pursued some progressive instincts, a very aggressive antitrust enforcer. And finally, Woodrow Wilson stepped up, seeking to found and implement a highly progressive agenda. I would argue, and I have argued in the book, that the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 is the high tide of the progressive era, though the progressive era arguably lasted through to 1920. The important thing to understand about financial crises generally is that they tend to promote the displacement of an older orthodoxy with new and insurgent ideas. And the insurgent ideas that I referred to were the populist and progressive sentiments of Bryan and Wilson. What engineered this shift of orthodoxy? First, it was the belief that Morgan's activism was self-serving, that there were rumors that J.P. Morgan had actually engineered the crisis of 1907 in an effort to earn a profit and or suppress his competitors in the financial services industry. By the way, I've studied the archives and I can find no evidence in support of that charge. That doesn't mean the evidence doesn't exist or that it wasn't true. It just says you can't prove it. And I think to us who toil in fields of history and economics and politics, we want the facts, and I think we should turn to the accusers to say, show us the beef. But the panic prompted a game of bargains among these conservatives, progressives, and populists, and this too is a regularity of financial crises. It stimulates intensive bargaining among affected groups. And the conservatives wanted actually to found a central bank, but Nelson Aldrich, the chair of the Senate Finance and Banking Committee, insisted that it be a private bank whose board would be populated by people who knew something about money and credit and banking, and that'd be private bankers. Well, that didn't sit well with the progressives and populists. The populists wanted people from Main Street rather than Wall Street to be reflected on the board of this central bank. Populists also wanted lots of money, lots of available credit, low interest rates, and frankly, if you read their materials, lurking beneath it all was a desire for a redistribution of income and wealth. Progressives, as I said, sought to apply the insights of social science, and three key issues emerged during the debates spawned by the Panic of 1907. And I think these three issues emanate directly from the Panic, which is why I highlight them. First was a debate over whether the bank should be unitary or federal in structure. Nelson Aldrich wanted one single bank and wanted it located in the money center of the United States, namely New York. The populists especially wanted a federal system. They wanted the money reserves of the country to be spread around the country. In one proposal, there was a call for as many as 20 distributed reserve banks. We wound up with a system of 12 districts for the Federal Reserve, and as the name indicates, yep, we got a federal system in contrast to virtually all other central banks in the world. The second key debate was whether the central bank should be private or public in ownership. At the time, Britain's central bank, the Bank of England, was privately owned, as it had been since 1696. It was only, the Bank of England was only nationalized in 1947 after World War II, as it has been ever since. But the key as of the post-crisis debate was who should own the bank, and the progressives insisted that the bank be government-owned. The third key debate was about currency. Should the currency of the United States being issued by this central bank, should it be an obligation of the private banks in the country, as it had been since the beginning of the country, or should it be an obligation of the federal government? And here too, William Jennings Bryan and the populists demanded that the currency be a federal government obligation. Therefore, if you follow Michael Caires' suggestion and look at the green bills in your wallet, they will say Federal Reserve Note. So in conclusion, the bargaining that I refer to that emanated from this crisis prompted three important displacements, actually four. The first is that a belief that state direction of monetary policy and money and credit would be better than market mechanisms for setting monetary conditions. The state knows better than markets. Jim Grant gave an excellent talk last night. Those of you who heard it, heard the counter-opposing view, which says, no, actually, markets are very good at sending signals for the allocation of resources in an economy. But state direction emerged. The second important displacement of incumbent orthodoxies was a belief that institutional agency is better than personal agency. J.P. Morgan's work to quell the Panic of 1907 is an example of personal agency. He was displaced, or people like him would be displaced by the institutional agency of the Fed. The third orthodoxy was that an oligopoly of these distributed reserve banks around the country would be better than an alleged private oligopoly of the so-called money trust that was accused of existing. And then the final orthodoxy was the belief that the geographic distribution of specie reserves would be better than the concentration of reserves in one place. In the 111 years since the founding of the Federal Reserve and the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, we have severely tested the efficacy of these new orthodoxies, and I look forward to the questions from the audience as a way of expanding upon them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That is why we need to spend a lot of time thinking about the Panic of 1907, because it was such a pivotal moment. And to further elaborate on the great pivot that happened at the beginning of the 20th century, we're joined by our fourth speaker, Christopher Cox. He's the former chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, so he knows a lot about that particular part of the industry. He also served in the House of Representatives here and from 1989 to 2005, where I got to know him very well, and is currently a senior scholar in residence at the University of California, Irvine. He has a new book forthcoming in November, so as soon as you finish reading Professor Bruner's book, you can read Professor Cox's book. It'll come out from Simon & Schuster, and it's titled Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. Chris will speak today on how financing World War I warped America's income tax and changed how the federal government borrowed to finance its debt. Chris, you have the dais, I guess.
Thank you, Dr. Beach, and really have enjoyed listening to these three presentations thus far and to your opening. It's a dismal topic, of course, to talk about debt, and there's a lot of data and so on, but we've just gotten through the Panic of 1907, and I'm going to downdate that to 1914, and I will say about the beginning of the 19th century, notwithstanding the dismal nature of this topic, that my assessment of the situation then is sort of what Mark Twain said about Richard Wagner's music: it's not as bad as it sounds. In the midsummer of 1914, baseball and sailing and tennis dominated the news. The sun was shining and the federal government's books were in balance. Payments on the modest debt, we talked about the importance of debt service, were an insignificant budget item. In dollar figures, the public debt stood at $2.9 billion. That's less than $29 a person alive in America at the time. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be $894 per capita. Compare that with our actual situation today, when the national debt is $103,000 per person, 115 times as much. But notwithstanding the relatively happy situation at that time, stiff winds were blowing across the Atlantic, took many by surprise in America in 1914. On July 30th of that summer, Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, gave a brief news conference. And he was asked, "Mr. President, have you taken any action at all on behalf of this government in connection with the war in Europe?" And Wilson answered in 2 words, "No, sir." Another reporter asked by way of follow-up, "Mr. President, have you gone at all into the probable effect of the European war on business conditions in this country?" The president responded, "Not at all yet." That same day, J.P. Morgan, who we've just heard about, who is now 77 years old, held an emergency meeting at his offices in New York City. The men who were crowded around his conference table were the officers of the nation's largest banks, Chase National Bank, First National Bank, Bankers Trust, Guarantee Trust, as well as the president of the New York Stock Exchange. It had been over a month at this point since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And the world was on edge because Austria-Hungary was at war with Serbia, and Russia was mobilizing for war against Austria-Hungary. In the panic over the threat of a broader war, securities exchanges throughout Europe had already closed. In Britain, technically they were open, but there were no buyers. Every investor and every government in Europe was dying to liquidate their securities, and the only market available to do that was here in the United States, the only major market remaining open. The bankers left the Morgan conclave that day and announced to the press they saw no reason to close the New York Stock Exchange, as the exchanges in Europe had all done, because they viewed the spreading conflict in Europe as containable, as a European problem. America, they were certain, would be largely immune from it. In fact, by remaining neutral, America's productive capacity could be put into the service of the suffering nations. We would produce their food, their textiles, their manufactured goods, things they couldn't do for themselves. And since this business would all be done on credit, not only America's producers, but America's banks would profit. The following morning, the same bankers who the day before were so confident awoke to headlines, making it clear that France and Britain would soon be drawn into the war. It was becoming clear that this was going to be a pan-European disaster. So Morgan summoned them all back to another meeting that very same day, and this time they decided the New York Stock Exchange would shut down immediately and indefinitely. The new reality demonstrated two things. First, America was neutral, but it was not immune by any means. And second, it would be immensely difficult for the government and for business to raise new capital without an efficient market to facilitate it. To everyone in America at the time, this idea that the New York Stock Exchange would just shut down with no date to open was as unthinkable as it would be to us today. By the end of 1914, it became very clear the market would have to reopen. And it did after a fashion on November 29th, but only for restricted business. It didn't fully reopen until months later, in April of 1915. That was a closure of nearly 9 months, by far the longest in history, before or since. For the next 2 years, the United States stayed out of the war. Woodrow Wilson ran for election in 1916 as the peace candidate, and by all accounts was reelected for that reason. While there was very much talk of military preparedness, military spending in those 2 years remained tiny, and the federal budget remained in balance. But this budget equipoise was short-lived, because Germany understood America's resolute neutrality to be a sign of weakness. And so Germany unleashed its policy of unlimited submarine warfare aimed at the merchant shipping of neutrals, and that changed everything. The moment that Congress declared war against Germany on the 14th of April, 1917, the federal spending spigots opened wide. In the peacetime years of Wilson's presidency, the run rate for federal spending was fairly constant at about $725 million per year, equivalent to $17 billion in today's currency. In 1916, the last year that America was still at peace before we entered the war, the federal government had run a surplus equal to 7% of the entire budget. Surpluses back then were common. It was the deficit years that were the exceptions. To that point, Wilson had run a surplus or broken even in 3 of his 4 budget years. But beginning in April 1917, this massive new wartime spending generated progressively higher deficits, totaling over $23 billion by the time the peace treaty was signed at Versailles. That's equal today to nearly $1.5 trillion. Keep in mind that that peacetime budget was $725 million. So in just 2.5 years, the nation added to its debt an amount equal to 32 years of peacetime federal spending. Fortunately for the nation, the Hamiltonian norm was alive and well in America. It may seem shocking to us now, but Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives back then saw the importance across the board of keeping borrowing to a minimum and, more importantly, of repaying it as quickly as possible. Woodrow Wilson and his Treasury Secretary William McAdoo said almost exactly that in their public pronouncements. In his war message to Congress on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson spoke of the borrowing that would be needed to finance the war and reminded both the House and the Senate of their duty, quote, to protect our people against the very serious hardships and evils likely to arise out of the inflation produced by vast loans. It would therefore be most unwise, Wilson said, to finance the war entirely on money borrowed. He proposed a partial pay-as-you-go approach, fleshed out by McAdoo as 1/3 taxation and 1/3 borrowing. The Treasury Secretary warned against financing the government, quote, upon the quicksands of inflation or unhealthy credit expansion, which he feared would bring ultimate destruction upon the country. McAdoo's post-war successor as Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, completely agreed. He said that to let the debt linger, or worse, to grow, was a sign of national debility. Now, the income tax was brand new back then. It was only 5 years old at this point, and there was a very meager experiential base on which to judge where, how, at what level to set tax rates. In the crisis of the World War, members of Congress in both parties were willing to support the Wilson administration's request for income tax rates that topped out at 77%. That's high, even by our standards, but imagine for a country that hadn't even had an income tax just a few years before. These sky-high tax rates very quickly proved suboptimal. High-bracket taxpayers whose income came from investments, and I mean obviously suboptimal from the taxpayer standpoint, but from the government standpoint, those high rates didn't work as intended, because the high-bracket taxpayers whose wealth and income was tied to investments could and quickly did rearrange their affairs to shield those investments from taxation. There were approximately 1,300 taxpayers in that top bracket, the highest bracket in 1916. It was 15% in 1916 when there were 1,300 taxpayers. 2 years later, when the rate was 77%, only 627 tax returns showed income in the highest bracket. In other words, over half of the top bracket simply disappeared. The Treasury learned the same lesson with its issuance of Liberty bonds during World War I. The first Liberty bonds were issued in April 1917, and they gave investors tax-free income, but capped the amount of the bonds that could be purchased with this benefit at $30,000. For the next 3 tranches of Liberty loans, the Treasury all but eliminated the tax exemption for higher bracket taxpayers, and not surprisingly, wealthy taxpayers didn't buy them. They instead bought state and municipal bonds in order to shield their income from taxation. The result was that it became harder for the Treasury to sell the Liberty bonds. By the time of the 5th and the last installment of war bonds, the so-called Victory Liberty Loan, the Treasury reversed course. The bonds were completely exempt from all income taxes with no upper limit on the amount that could be purchased with this benefit. After the war, it fell to President Warren Harding, and after his untimely death, President Calvin Coolidge, to deal with paying down what was now the accumulation of $26 billion of Liberty loans and other government borrowings that had been amassed during the war. They took to heart these hard lessons learned from experimentation with near confiscatory tax rates. While they set to work reducing federal spending to normal levels, and we've seen some of that in the charts, they brought tax rates down to earth as well. Tax rates fell every year from 1921 to 1925 from a top rate of 77% to 25%. Congress was supportive of these policies, of course. It couldn't have happened otherwise. In 1921, Senate Majority Leader Henry Cabot Lodge explained, quote, "We have a huge legacy of debts which must be dealt with. Expenditures must be cut down. every effort must be made to reduce the taxation made necessary by war. By 1924, Harding, Coolidge, and Congress had cut federal spending by 84% compared to the peak wartime level of 1919. In that year alone, they paid down nearly $1 billion in debt, equivalent today to $17 billion in debt payoff. I will leave it to Dr. Beach to explain in greater detail the success of these policies, but suffice to say that between 1920 and 1928, government paid off 36% of the entire national debt. This is, however, the end of the happy part of this story. The rest of the First World War debt remains unpaid. We've been paying interest on it for over 100 years. It's just now part of our $34 trillion debt, over 40% of which has been added in just the last 7 years. In 2024, the interest cost of carrying all of this debt will be more than the entire defense budget. By itself, interest will consume 1/3 of all the income taxes paid by everybody in this room and every individual American. So, while this brief presentation was formally entitled The Rise and Fall of World War I Debt, the true story, downdated today, should be titled The Rise and Fall and Rise and Explosion of the National Debt. Thank you.
My gosh, Chris. Well, there's another book we have to read. That's just terrific. So let me do a couple of minutes of summing up, and that will give you time to write down your questions, which you can ask when a Coolidge employee, staff member walks around with the microphone and gives you that opportunity. We will continue on through 10:30, and then at 10:30 we will take a break. So what we've done here in this panel, if you haven't had time to absorb it, is we've set the Hamiltonian norm. Congressman Hill did a great job of going through the details of that, how there was an interplay between banking thinking, monetary thinking, credit thinking, legislation, the location of the capital. Holy smokes. And that's terrific. And then we had a brief recital of how crises have shaped that great policy portfolio. The Civil War, the introduction of monetary innovations, the way in which our banking system was stressed, and I will kind of go a little bit beyond where Professor Caires went with saying, look, we've got an expanding population. We're one of the largest countries in the world with population that's economically tied with inside itself, tariff-free boundaries, and so that was a huge stress. Then, of course, all this comes to a different head at the end of the 19th century. I think I'm right, Professor Bruner, in saying that J. Pierpont Morgan saved the Cleveland administration with a train full of gold, which he sent down to pay the bills during a particularly hard time. So the interplay between private banking and debt was visible in trainloads of gold. But the crisis of 1907 put in place just this enormous, and we're still working with it, political change, populism in the agrarian world, progressivism in the urban world, which came to a great head during the First World War. And we've just heard from Chris the impact that transformation of our monetary and fiscal system had during that period of time. Let me just say just a couple of things about Harding Coolidge, and this will only be a couple of moments, because we've had some excellent statistical elements laid out by Chris Cox. The really important period of 1921 through 1929, it can be summed up by saying it was the reset of the Hamiltonian norm on two fronts. We don't often think about this, but one of the most important things that have happened in the Harding period that was implemented by President Coolidge was the first true Budget Act, setting up the Office of the Budget in the White House. It's called the Budget and Accounting Act. we really had a very primitive system, slipshod system of budgeting. Was run primarily by Congress. No offense, but the administration was not heavily involved. But then again, we didn't have a large administrative state. With the growth of government during World War II, now we needed to have something that would bring about public accounting at the federal level. And so I think one of the most important things in our debt history, in the Hamiltonian norms history, is the development of tools by which the president could control the budget. And this was crucial. And then there was the frugality, the famous frugality of President Coolidge. He not only set up a budgeting system, but he told subsequent presidents, and here's what you can do with it. Spending dropped by 42% during his administration. I mean, there's very few times in U.S. history, even prior to that, when spending was as big in the sort of reduction. He had a total, over his administration, a total budget surplus of $7.3 billion in 1920s dollars. So frugality, demonstrably something that you can do. And what were the benefits of that? Here's just some ideas of the economic implications. We can't say a dollar saved produced a dollar in your pocket as a consumer, right? It's hard to do that because of the tremendous complexity of the economy. Nevertheless, inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, which is the way we kind of measure things these days, increased by 60% from 1921 to 1929. On a per-person basis, GDP per person rose 42%, and the average annual growth rate in the 1920s of gross national product, a little different concept, was 6% per year. This, of course, obscures the fact that we had huge improvements in well-being. You know, cars, indoor plumbing. Indoor plumbing is important to me. So electricity, all these things that made life so much better. Here's just two more statistics. The labor force across this period grew by 5.1 million, or 13%, between 1921 and 1929. But total employment grew by 25%. So even though the labor force is growing, we're getting jobs for people who were unemployed in the early 1920s. So we had a lot of deep improvement. And finally, the consumer price index fell by 4% across this period of time. So it isn't true that rapid growth always produces higher prices. In this case, rapid growth produced lower prices. We got lower prices, we got reduction in government spending, we got reduction in government debt. The 1920s is a roadmap for the 2020s. I'm absolutely certain of that. All right, now we'll go to questions, and I have a really hard question to start with, but I'd like to have a question from the audience here. If you have a question, please identify yourself. There's a question right here, and if you'll wait for the microphone, we'll go to you first, sir. And yes, you right there, you in the striped tie, and if you stand up, that's very good. Thank you.
Good. Just a quick question for perhaps you. You spoke earlier about the Hamiltonian norm, which I thought I heard is pay down your debts. And then soon afterwards, I heard Senator Walsh saying, pay your bills. Now, I'm not sure in the second case, does that mean paying the debt, paying the interest on a timely basis,
Right.
or paying down the debt? Can we get clarification
So
on
I
that
think,
in terms of the Hamiltonian norm?
Sure, thank you. So the norm is refers to the quality of the debt, have the highest quality debt. How do you get the quality of the debt? How do you make sure our debt is really high quality? You pay your bills. And you make sure that you don't do anything from a spending standpoint that endangers or makes it seem like you might not pay your bills. So one of the things that the early founders were very concerned about, because they had experiences throughout their, the history of government, if you will. There had not too many republics prior to ours, but there have been lots of governments prior to ours, is how, and especially the English government, how spending had been the ruin of money, how spending had been the ruin of credibility and credit. How many English kings overspent and produced tremendous political and economic dislocation in their own countries. It was just one after another, after another, after another. So they had that experience, and they knew a lot about what happens when that occurs. That's what we now in modern times call fiscal dominance. You get inflation, you get distrust, you get political turmoil. So the Hamiltonian norm was directly addressed to that outcome. How do we avoid that outcome? We make sure that our credit is gold standard, maybe not literally gold, but gold standard in a sense. The debt's convertible, it pays what it is, we have low inflation or no inflation. Yeah, those are all aspects of that. We have a question over here, and if you could wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, this is a question for Congressman Hill. I enjoyed your retelling of Hamilton's attempts to get the debt plan through and the subsequent compromise of 1790. I was wondering, in your experience from within the House, what social or political reasons have led to the complete modern-day rejection of the Hamiltonian norm and the gridlock we see when it comes to government spending in the budget?
Well, thanks for the question, and I think you're going to hear a lot of discussion of that in the panels that are going to follow us. But there's been a breakdown in the consistency of having a minimal deficit, now for really 60 years, in the years post-World War II. And part of that is the transition that Coolidge didn't deal with. Coolidge rejected a veterans plan. It was very, very controversial in the 1920s. But we have accumulated a series of promises to pay in what we call our mandatory spending programs, that even since David Stockman was budget director, you've seen a complete inversion of mandatory spending as a percentage of the total budget versus the discretionary spending that you hear Congress fighting about all the time. This fighting that we voted yesterday to fund half the government appropriations for fiscal 24, a few months late, is about a third of the budget. And 70% of the budget is now demographically based or actuarially based on a promise to pay a veteran's pension, a Social Security payment, a Medicare, a Medicaid obligation to the states or to people over a certain age in the United States. And it's flipped that budgetary discipline on its head. And when David was the director under President Reagan, it was the inverse, basically. But over that 60-year period, and you're going to hear all about that today, we're going to talk about that in detail, but fundamentally, that means that Congress every year is fighting and voting on appropriations bills that are a third of federal spending. So many of us have advocated serious changes to what we call mandatory spending programs, but that falls frequently on deaf ears for both Republicans and Democrats.
Thank you, Congressman. We have a question here.
Hi, my name is Yehyun. I have a question for Dr. Michael Caires. So, to my knowledge, Andrew Jackson was the first and only president to have completely paid off the national debt. Yet he also abolished the Second Bank of the United States, which led to the Panic of 1837. So, with his seemingly responsible and irresponsible actions, what were his motivations for those actions, and does he have any lasting impact on our philosophies today?
It's an interesting question. Jacksonian thought is very different from other styles of economic thought that we would try to compare it to. It really has to be put in a box of the early 19th century. It comes out of Jeffersonian thought, absolutely. Jefferson himself and Jeffersonians in general disliked all debt. And there was a hostility towards banking in general. So in Jackson's administration, and it's not, Jackson's thoughts are very, how do I put it, like direct. Though he had his kitchen cabinet, people around him who were writing lots of pamphlets and kind of producing the economic thought of Jacksonians in that period. And the basics were, and I didn't get into this, but when you think about currency and banking in the early 19th century, of course they're connected today. But it's a little bit different in the early 19th century because in most of the United States, the money that people used came from a bank. Banks would issue state banknotes, and folks would use that in their everyday transactions. And there wasn't the kind of banking regulation that existed in that period was all over the place, which meant that there was a propensity for banks to fail, which means the money that people had in their hands would become worthless. So Jackson's administration took hostility towards that. Their going theory was that these banks are the ones that create panics, and they should be getting rid of. And so there's a strong hostility towards the banking system. There's a strong hostility towards debt. So that explains the two parts of Jackson's actions towards debt and the Bank of the United States. There's a last part that Jackson had mentioned, but comes to fruition really later in the Polk administration during the Mexican-American War, which is the creation of the independent treasury. So, of course, Jackson vetoes the bank. Secretary of the Treasury at the time, Roger B. Taney, takes the U.S.'s deposits out of the bank, places it in a series of state banks called the pet banks. The Jacksonians became quickly aware that since the United States is probably the biggest cash reserve in the entire country, the single biggest, wherever those deposits are put, they're going to have a dramatic effect on the economy. So the Jacksonians, and it, again, comes to fruition in the Polk administration, take all the money out of all the banks, create what's called the independent sub-treasury system, where the United States basically, one author called it the equivalent of the state of finance during the War of Roses, and just put the money in a nice iron box. So the United States, under the Independent Treasury Act, was required to make all payments in gold and silver. So that would literally mean, I'm sure if you've been on Wall Street and been there, the federal building there was the sub-treasury of the United States. If you were a worker at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, that meant that on payday, the U.S. government would put gold on a cart, and the cart would go down the street to pay its employees or its creditors. This is actually part of the problem during the Civil War, because there's no allowance for flexibility in there. So part of the problem why the bankers of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston suspend specie payment is because the system that was proposed was Chase would borrow money, then the gold that they paid out would make it back into the system, but that circular motion wasn't working fast enough, and nobody's really sure why it didn't exactly work. That's what leads to the Panic of 1861, which leads to the Legal Tender Act. That is a very long answer to a question that started in the 1830s, but ended in the Civil War.
Well, it just typifies the complexity of this issue. The issues are. Now, we have a number of bankers in the room today. They don't need to identify themselves. But for those of you who are among our student population and are thinking about banking, this is your time to figure out whether you want to be in charge of a sub-treasury, pushing the gold cart, issuing the money, painting the greenbacks, or doing what you want to do. We only have a couple of minutes left, and it wouldn't be fair to a question from the audience of only giving 2 minutes. But I just want to emphasize again that there's a complex foundation for the problem that we face of the debt. Oftentimes is so simplified that we lose our perspective on the handles that are available for us to solve the problem. And one way to identify and appreciate what we can do is to identify what was done in the past and appreciate what was done in the past. And look at the foundations. It's always important in public policy that we do that.